Hi, this is Jeff with FrostyGarden.com, and today we're going to take you along on one of our nursery rounds. We're going to talk about what we're looking for in our seedlings and basically how we're mitigating any issues that do come up as they come up. It's really important to check your seedlings daily because problems can develop very quickly, and it's important to get those things taken care of as soon as you possibly can. So we're going to show you what we're looking for, and if you're interested in this topic, come along for the ride. When we do our nursery rounds, we're mostly doing a visual inspection of all of our plants. One of the biggest things that we're looking for is to make sure that our plants have an appropriate amount of moisture in the soil. Plants can use up their moisture in their soil very quickly, and it's important to make sure that they're well watered throughout their life cycle. So number one, we're looking at the soil here, and we're trying to find out, is there any issues with things being dry? And you can sometimes get a good idea just looking at the soil itself, because dry soil tends to look like dry soil. In other cases, you might have some that actually look a little bit darker, or maybe the plant is actually covering the entire soil, and it can be difficult to get a visual inspection of what's going on. So we're going to show you some of our tips and tricks of how we basically assess the soil and the soil moisture. In some of our trays, we notice that we might have varying levels of moisture. Some of the six-packs might look moist, whereas some of the six-packs might actually look dry. In that case, often what we will do is we'll actually pick up one of the individual six-packs and kind of feel how heavy it is. Dry soil is going to be very light, whereas moist soil is going to have a little bit of heft to it. So if you don't get a good visual indicator, a good thing to check is basically whether the actual individual six-packs or plants are feeling particularly dry. Another trick that we often do is when we have all of the same kind of plant in a given tray, we can assess the entire tray. When all of the plants are the same, they're often going to have very similar uptake of water requirements. And so oftentimes we can actually pick up the tray itself and we can see whether those trays are feeling particularly dry. Again, a dry tray is going to feel fairly light, whereas a more moist tray is going to feel fairly heavy. So that's another good way that you can assess the moisture levels of your plants. These plants are an example where the color of the soil is not necessarily a good indicator of the soil's moisture level. In this particular case, the soil does appear somewhat dark, but if we pick up the individual plants, we'll notice that they're actually quite dry. So we know that on these plants, we do need to get some water in these trays in order to ensure that they have constant access to water. When we come across a tray that has some trays that are actually quite moist and others that are quite dry, such as these, one of the things that we'll often do is we'll remove the individual six-packs and put them into another tray. And what this allows us to do is basically water this tray, and we prevent overwatering the other tray. So it's really important to get an even amount of watering across all of your plants, and separating them out so that you can water them separately is a good technique to make sure that the ones that need moisture will get additional watering and the ones that don't do not. Since we're talking about watering here, we're going to show you how we actually water our plants. First, we start with a couple of 2-gallon watering cans. It's nice to be able to bring out 4 gallons of water at a time, and we've already identified our plants that we need to actually water. So what we do is we use a technique called bottom watering, and basically we use these 10-20 trays here, and what we do is we put our water in the actual tray as opposed to top watering our plants and putting the water on the actual plant itself. We fill the trays up about halfway and put all of our plants back in, and what will happen is that water will absorb into the soil and create a nice even moisture content in the soil itself. Okay, so in this case, we've noticed that some of these plants are a little bit drier than others, and so one of the things we're going to do is move those plants into a tray, and we're going to water those plants all together. Okay, now we have a complete tray of plants that need to be watered, and so we are going to water this tray. And one of the things that we've kind of noticed is that when we move the trays around, or the six-packs around like this, we are generally getting like among like as far as water uptake. And that's generally a good thing, and that way you have nice even water uptake across an entire tray. One of the things that we're interested in knowing is if our plants are taking up the water that we give them in a very rapid fashion. That to us indicates that the plants might actually need to be up-potted into a larger container. Around here, we don't really have staff or anything like that we can constantly be watering our plants, and more soil is going to allow you more time to go between your individual waterings. Another thing you can assess is looking at the bottom of the tray or the pot that you're actually using. If you see roots coming out of the bottom, that's an indicator that you need to pot up. One of the other things that we're looking for, particularly right after we harden off, is whether we're seeing any symptoms of tip burn or other issues that might be developing with our plant and the related sun. When looking at this lobelia here, I can see some small amounts of tip burn on the individual leaves, but this to me does not look like a severe enough case where we need to actually deal with anything. But it's good, especially right after you harden off, to give a good visual inspection of your plants, and if you're seeing significant amounts of tip burn, get those plants back inside because they're not ready to actually be outside yet. Speaking of problems that can develop during hardening off, it's really important to observe your plants when they're hardening off. For example, this corn here has big, broad leaves, and that's very subject to problems when you're hardening off. What we're generally looking for are any kind of white spots or tip burn that might be developing on our plants. We keep a really close eye on it. If your plants are generally droopy, that's not usually a problem. Droopiness is not necessarily something that'll be an issue, but it might be indicating that you need to put more water in your soil. But generally speaking, plants are a little bit moody when they start getting used to being outdoors, and so you might notice that droopiness, but that's not a problem you need to correct. One of the other things that we're looking for is whether we're seeing any cold stress on any of our plants. Cold stress really presents as just the plants looking stressed out. Generally speaking, they won't just look very good and all of that, and when they're healthy looking, you know that you're not getting any cold stress situations. This is particularly a problem for us in cold climate environments, where if we're going beyond the capabilities of the individual plant, the plants can actually experience cold stress, and they will visibly show it. If that's the case, the conditions are probably a little too cool, and maybe you should consider bringing some of your plants inside. One of the other things that we're looking for is whether we're seeing any signs of nutritional deficiency. It might not translate well across this camera, but one of the things that I'm noticing in these asparagus here is that we're seeing somewhat yellowing tips. That's an indicator that these plants aren't getting enough nitrogen, and it's probably a good idea for us to consider fertilizing this plant. We have fertilized this plant a couple of times, but note that plants will go through the available fertilizers, and you sometimes have to supplement multiple times in the early season. In some cases relating to nutrition, plants like this moringa here sometimes are just a little bit moody. If you notice, we're seeing a lot of yellowing across the leaves, and the problem in this case is not necessarily nutritional. The issue for this particular plant is that these are rather large plants. They're functionally a tree, and growing in these small pots is not necessarily what they want to do. It's not what they call a good time. So in this case, we really need to get these plants up into a larger container. So we're going to be doing that here this weekend, and we know that that needs to be done because we've grown moringa multiple times, and we've seen this problem present before. While we don't see very many problems with bugs and aphids and other issues in the early season typically, we do often assess our plants for any kind of aphids that might be developing. This can be particularly problematic in a greenhouse like what we're growing in here, and what we'll do is we'll inspect a few of our plants and basically look at the underleaves and any branches where aphids might actually want to show up, and we want to just do a quick visual inspection to make sure that we don't have any early aphid problems. In this particular case, I haven't seen any, so it's still not a problem yet. Another thing that we're looking for sometimes is in our nursery, we might see individual weeds develop. If we notice that, then basically all we need to do is come out and remove those weeds. If unmitigated, these weeds can get actually quite large, and so it's a really good idea to remove them early because they're easier to remove, and then they won't be competing with your plants. If you're a newer grower, one of the things that we generally recommend is spending a little bit of time practicing plant identification. Some plants are really easy to identify, such as these onions, but a lot of plants have very similar growing characteristics. For example, this celery grows very similar to this cilantro. Being able to tell those two apart is really important because one is actually a warmer climate crop and one is a cooler climate crop. Likewise, we also have some parsley over here that also grows very similarly to celery and cilantro. So being able to tell those apart is really helpful. Also, brassicas tend to look a lot alike. Oftentimes we can't even tell the difference, and you know, it's a roll of the dice, but that's why we label all of our plants and try to keep track of them as best as we can. Thanks for watching. Once again, I'm Jeff with FrostyGarden.com. In case you didn't know, FrostyGarden.com has a ton of cold climate gardening articles focused on making you a better cold climate gardener. We're a small channel, and likes and subscribes really help us. We'd appreciate it if you gave us one. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time.